Flood came without warning, the way the worst things always do. It had been raining for 4 days straight across Harlan County, Kentucky. The kind of rain that doesn't fall so much as press down, like the sky itself has decided to sit on the valley. The creek behind Route 119 had been rising since Tuesday. By Friday morning, it wasn't a creek anymore. It was something else entirely, something without a name, brown and fast and indifferent, carrying fence posts and lawn chairs and the occasional propane tank past the blurred windows of houses that had stood there for 60 years. James Calloway had been awake since 3 in the morning. He sat at the kitchen table of his grandfather's farmhouse, his farmhouse now, he supposed, though he still couldn't say those words without a small internal flinch drinking coffee that had gone cold sometime around 4, and watching the water inch closer across the back field. He had moved the truck to higher ground the night before. He had brought the generator inside. He had done all the things a man with any sense would do, and then he had sat down and run out of things to do, which was the part he was worst at. James was 53 years old. He had spent 22 of those years as a Navy SEAL, 8 deployments, 4 continents, more close calls than he'd ever listed on any official document. He had come home from his last deployment to find his wife Carol 3 months into a diagnosis she hadn't told him about. She had not wanted to worry him. That was the thing about Carol. Even when she was dying, she was thinking about someone else. She had been gone for 2 years now. The farmhouse still smelled like her sometimes, early in the morning before he opened the windows. Lavender and coffee and something else he couldn't name, just her. Just Carol, a scent that had no scientific explanation and no adequate substitute. He had learned not to chase it when it appeared. He just sat still and let it pass through him, the way you learn to let certain things pass through you when the alternative is being destroyed by them. He had come back to Harlan County because he didn't know where else to go. His grandfather had left him the property, 40 acres, a farmhouse that needed more work than James had motivation for, and a barn that had been slowly returning itself to the earth for the better part of a decade. He had told himself it was temporary. That was 8 months ago. The boxes in the second bedroom were still taped shut. The rain picked up again around 6. James pulled on his rain jacket and his boots and went out to check the drainage ditch along the north fence line. He didn't need to. There was nothing out there he could fix, but he needed to move. Standing still for too long had started to feel like sinking. The fields were underwater to his ankles. He walked the fence line anyway, flashlight cutting a pale tunnel through the gray morning, and that was when he heard it. Not above the rain, nothing was above the rain, but beneath it, in the brief pocket of quiet between one gust and the next, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. He stopped. There it was again. He had spent enough time in enough places to know the difference between sounds that meant nothing and sounds that meant something. This was the second kind. He turned and pointed his flashlight toward the old equipment shed at the far edge of the property, a structure he used approximately never, full of his grandfather's rusted implements and the particular smell of old grease and mouse nests. The door was hanging open. He hadn't left it open. He crossed the field toward it, and before he'd covered half the distance, he could hear it clearly. Now a thin, high sound, repeated and urgent, the kind of sound that bypasses your thinking mind entirely and goes straight to something older. He pulled the shed door the rest of the way open and put his flashlight inside. There were 4 of them. A black Labrador mix, soaking wet, pressed into the far corner between a tractor tire and a rusted disc harrow. Around her, tucked against her sides and between her front legs, were 3 puppies, maybe 6 or 7 weeks old, James estimated, small enough that 2 of them could have fit in his cupped hands. The mother looked up at him with the particular expression of a dog who has exhausted every other option and is now gambling everything on this one stranger. The 4th sound had been her. The crying had been hers. James stood in the doorway for a moment, rain hitting the back of his jacket, and took stock of the situation. The mother was thin, not starved, but clearly hadn't been eating well. No collar. The puppies were moving, which was the important thing, all 3 of them pressing harder against their mother at the intrusion of the flashlight. One of them, the smallest, a brown and black thing with oversized ears, had its eyes still mostly shut. "All right," James said, to no one in particular, or maybe to all of them. "All right." He went back to the house and got a laundry basket, 2 old towels he didn't care about. and a can of the chicken soup he'd been saving for no particular reason. He came back and set the basket down and crouched at the shed entrance, making himself small, moving slowly, letting the mother track his every movement with those amber eyes. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, which was the kind of thing a man said when he knew words didn't matter but felt compelled to fill the silence anyway. "I've got nowhere to be. It took 11 minutes." He counted. The mother sniffed his hand, drew the length of it, then his sleeve, then seemed to make some internal calculation that landed somewhere between desperate and resigned. She stood carefully, and each puppy made a small noise of protest at the interruption of warmth. She looked at James. She looked at the basket. She looked back at James. Then she walked forward and got in the basket herself, turned twice, and waited. James experienced something in that moment that he would not have known how to name. It wasn't exactly emotion, and it wasn't exactly not emotion. It was more like the ground shifting slightly under his feet, not enough to knock him down, just enough to remind him that it could. He carried them all inside. He set the basket next to the wood stove and got the fire going and peeled off his soaked jacket and stood in the kitchen in his wet socks and watched the mother nurse the puppies back to steady breathing. He heated the chicken soup and set some in a shallow bowl near the basket. She ate it without looking up, the way animals eat when they've learned that meals can be interrupted. He sat down on the floor next to them. His knees were not happy about this. He sat there anyway. "Okay," he said again. The smallest puppy, the one with the oversized ears, had worked its way to the edge of the basket and was now pressed against its mother's tail, apparently using it as a supplemental pillow. James watched it breathe. In and out. In and out. The tiny certainty of it. The flood peaked around noon and began receding by mid-afternoon. James spent the morning on the floor next to the wood stove, intermittently pretending to read a 3-month-old newspaper and actually watching 4 dogs sleep. He got up occasionally to check the water level, to refill the mother's bowl, to add wood to the fire. He realized somewhere around 10 o'clock, calmer than he'd been in months, maybe longer. He didn't examine that too closely. By early afternoon, the rain had softened to a drizzle, and James was on his back porch assessing the mud situation when he heard tires on the gravel drive, which surprised him, because he hadn't told anyone he was here, and the road hadn't been passable 2 hours ago. He came around the side of the house to find a red pickup truck idling at the top of the drive, and a woman in her mid-60s standing beside it looking at him with an expression that suggested she had expected someone taller. Her name, he would learn, was Ruth Denny. She was the neighbor from the farm on the other side of the ridge, the one he'd seen exactly twice in 8 months, once at the hardware store in town, and once at the end of his own driveway, when he'd accidentally left his gate open and 3 of her sheep had wandered through it. They had not, in either encounter, progressed beyond an exchange of names and basic livestock-related logistics. She was holding a covered dish. "Thought you might not have gotten to the store before it hit," she said, by way of explanation. Not apology, James noticed. Just explanation. She stated it the way you'd state a weather forecast, something that was simply true and didn't require any particular ceremony around it. "I was all right," he said. "I can see that." She looked at the mud on his boots. "You been out in it? Had to check the drainage?" She nodded. That apparently satisfied whatever question she'd had. She held out the covered dish, a casserole of some kind, still warm. "It's chicken and rice, nothing special." James took it. He was not entirely sure what to do with the interaction, which was unusual. He had negotiated with people in situations that would not be described in polite company, and he was finding this woman from the next ridge inexplicably harder to read. She had the quality of certain landscapes presenting nothing actively hostile, but declining to be entirely legible either. "There's a dog inside," he heard himself say. She had puppies. Found them in the equipment shed this morning. Ruth's expression shifted, not dramatically, just a degree or two. Something becoming less neutral without quite becoming something else. "Black one," she said, "with a white patch on the chest?" James thought back. "Yeah, that's Bea." She said it simply, with the weight of someone who'd been wondering about a thing for a while. She was Earl Combs's dog over on Sawmill Road. He passed in March. Family. Took the other 2 dogs, but I don't think they knew she was expecting. She paused. I've been putting food out by the tree line for a couple weeks. Didn't know where she'd gotten to. They stood with this information for a moment. You want to come in? James asked, which was not something he usually offered. He had not had anyone inside the farmhouse in 8 months. The boxes were still in the second bedroom. The coffee mugs were still arranged the way Carol had arranged them, and he had not moved them, and he would have found it difficult to explain why. Ruth looked at the house. Then she looked at him with a kind of directness that some people lose somewhere in their 20s, and others are simply born without, and she apparently still had in full. I won't stay long, she said, which was, he supposed, an answer. Inside, she crouched beside the basket without being told where it was. She seemed to navigate by some internal compass that James found simultaneously annoying and impressive, and put her hand out toward Bea without reaching, just offering, the way someone does when they've spent a long time around animals. Bea stretched her nose forward and touched Ruth's fingers briefly, and that apparently settled it. She looks good, Ruth said, considering. She was cold when I found her. She's stubborn is what she is. Ruth looked at the 3 puppies. How many? 3? All moving? All moving? She nodded and stood up, and James noticed her do the same small inventory of joints thing he did when he stood the brief reorganization of a body that had been used hard and was now in negotiation with time. She caught him noticing, and he looked away, and there was a moment that might have been awkward if either of them had been the kind of person who let moments be awkward. She went to the kitchen and stood in the doorway without entering it, and James realized she was looking at the 2 coffee mugs on the counter, the ones he hadn't moved with. The quiet recognition of someone who understood without being told. You were married, she said. It wasn't a question. 2 years ago, he said. She passed. Ruth nodded, still looking at the mugs. My husband, Frank, died 6 years ago. Heart attack? He was 58. She paused. 58 seems a lot younger than it did when I was 30. James didn't say anything because there was nothing to say, and he was old enough to know the difference between silence that needed to be filled and silence that was doing its own work. Frank would have been out here at 4 in the morning checking that creek, Ruth said, and something in her voice shifted just slightly, just for a second, like a door opening an inch and then closing again. He never could just watch something and not do anything about it. She seemed to realize she was talking and made a small adjustment, a tightening of something in her expression, and turned from the kitchen doorway. Anyway. James set the casserole on the counter. You don't have to go, he said. He surprised himself with this. He hadn't planned it. It arrived the way some honest things arrive, without clearance from whatever part of you is supposed to approve these things first. Ruth looked at him. I've got a barn cat and a 3-legged goat that need checking, she said. After that, he said. She didn't say anything for a long moment. The fire popped once. From the basket near the wood stove came the small collective sound of puppies readjusting, which is one of those sounds that makes any room more bearable. I'll see how it goes, she said. She came back at 4 o'clock. She didn't knock. She called from the porch, and James found himself at the door before she'd finished calling, which was something he didn't analyze. She had a thermos of coffee, and he had finished the morning's pot hours ago, and they sat at the kitchen table while the rain made its final, half-hearted effort against the windows, and talked about things that were easier than the things they were actually talking about. She told him about Frank and the goat. The goat had gotten its leg caught in a piece of equipment 3 winters ago, and Frank had driven it 40 minutes to the vet in the cab of his truck, with its head on his lap. And she had stood in the barn after they'd left and laughed and cried at the same time in a way that she still hadn't entirely figured out. James told her about the time he'd carried a teammate 3 miles through a ravine in the dark, and how he still thought about the particular weight of another person's trust when your legs are the only thing between them and the worst outcome. He didn't say the teammate's name. Ruth didn't ask. She understood, he thought, the way some people understand things. They haven't been told, not through inference exactly, but through the same kind of listening that requires more than ears. Bea, at some point, got up from the basket and walked across the kitchen and lay down next to James's chair. Just like that, no ceremony. As if she'd decided something and wasn't interested in making a production of it, Ruth watched this happen. Her expression did the thing again, that slight opening, and this time she let it stay. "She doesn't do that with everyone," Ruth said. "I noticed she's selective," James said. "Frank said she used to pick one person and that was it. That was her person." Ruth looked at the dog, then at James. Earl Combs had her since she was 8 weeks old. She never left his side. James looked down at Bea, who was not looking back at him but simply existing in his vicinity, breathing steadily, one ear tracking the weather outside. He thought about what it meant to be chosen by something that had good reason not to trust something that had been cold and lost and hungry and alone and had, despite all of that, extended its nose toward a stranger in a doorway and made a decision. He thought about Carol and the things she had known about people, how she could read a room the way some people read weather, how she always said that the real stories weren't in what people said, but in what they got quiet about. He thought about her not telling him, about how that was her version of love, protecting him, and how for a long time he'd been angry about it at her almost, which was a shameful thing to feel, which he'd carried quietly for 2 years. He thought, sitting at that kitchen table while a woman from the next ridge poured him coffee from her thermos, that he might be getting a little tired of carrying things quietly. "She can stay," he said, "Bea, until the puppies are old enough, if you think that's all right." Ruth considered this. "I can bring food," she said. "I've got supplies. You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She said this with the particular precision of someone who understands the difference between obligation and choice. "I'll bring food." The weeks that followed, Ruth came every other day. Sometimes it was food for Bea, mostly, though she also brought things for James that she described with the same matter-of-fact practicality as the dog food, made too much cornbread, or had extra squash from the garden. He ate all of it. He had not eaten particularly well in 8 months, and he recognized, distantly, that he had not noticed this until there was something better to compare it to. The puppies grew with the speed that puppies grow, which is the speed of something that knows it doesn't have time to waste. The one with the oversized ears turned out to be a female, and she was bold in the way that smallest siblings sometimes are. The first to the food bowl, the first to the doorway, the first to put her ridiculous ears in whatever direction a new sound was coming from. The other two were males, easier and rounder. The kind of dogs who seemed to be smiling even when asleep. James did not name them. He told himself this was because they weren't his dogs. They belonged to Bea, he reasoned, or to the situation, or to whatever came next. But Ruth caught him one afternoon talking to the female, just talking to her, low and conversational, the way you talk to someone you're comfortable with, and raised her eyebrow in a way that required no words. "She's thinking," he said. "What are you calling her when you talk to her?" Ruth asked. He didn't answer. Ruth smiled, not broadly but with the particular quality of a person who has won something and doesn't feel the need to announce it. One evening, about 3 weeks after the flood, they were sitting on the porch watching the puppies investigate the yard in their lurching, unsteady way. The evening was mild, which was a relief after the weeks of weather. And the light was doing that thing it does in eastern Kentucky in June, going amber, and then gold, and then something past gold that doesn't have a name. "You're staying, aren't you?" Ruth said. It was not a question. James thought about the boxes in the second bedroom. He thought about the coffee mugs. "I moved the boxes," he said, "last week." Ruth nodded. "Not unpack them," he clarified. "Just move them to the closet." "That's something," she said. "I know it's something." They sat. "I know it's something." They sat. The 3-legged goat, whose name James had learned, was Patterson, which was Frank's mother's maiden name, which was the kind of detail that made a person feel something they couldn't quite categorize, was visible at the edge of the property, grazing with the serene indifference of an animal that has survived worse than what you're currently worried about. Bea was on the porch between them, her head on her front paws, monitoring the puppies with the steady vigilance of a mother who trusts the situation but isn't ready to stop watching. "Frank would have liked you," Ruth said. "He didn't have much patience with people who needed a lot of managing." "I'm not sure that's a compliment." "It's a fact," she said, which was essentially Ruth's version of a compliment, and James had come to understand this. He looked out at the puppies, at the goat, at the amber light coming down through the tree line, and felt something that he'd spent a long time not feeling, because not feeling it had been the only way to keep moving. It wasn't happiness exactly. It was something more like readiness, the particular settling of a person who has been standing in a doorway for too long and has finally, quietly, stepped inside. The female puppy, the one with the ears, came barreling up the porch steps and put her front paws on James's knee and looked at him with the absolute certainty of a creature who does not question whether she is welcome. He put his hand on her head. "Dot," he said. Ruth looked at him. "She's got that spot on her ear," he said. "It's been Dot in my head for 2 weeks." Ruth looked at the puppy, then back at him. "Dot," she repeated. "Don't. I didn't say anything. You were about to." She looked at the yard again, and she was smiling, more openly than he'd seen before, with less management of it. "I was going to say it's a good name," she said. "Frank always named everything, too. The barn cat, the tractor, everything." "What was the tractor's name?" "Gerald." James laughed. It was a real laugh, not the polite kind, not the obligatory kind, but the kind that arrives from somewhere unguarded. It surprised him a little. Ruth looked at him like she'd been waiting for it, and he thought she probably had been, in the patient way she waited for things that were worth waiting for. On the last Sunday of June, James went into the house and found a hammer and a chisel in his grandfather's toolbox, and he went to the barn and found a piece of white oak that had been sitting in the rafters for longer than he could guess. He worked on it for 2 evenings longer than he needed to, adjusting the letters twice, sanding until his hands ached. He had spent 22 years being excellent at things that required speed and precision and leaving no trace. This was different. This was a thing meant to stay. Ruth came on Wednesday and found him on a ladder by the front gate. She stood at the end of the drive with her hands in her jacket pockets and watched him hang it. A wooden sign, white oak, letters burned clean. Callaway Farm. Est, 1948. Still here. He climbed down and stood beside her, and they both looked at it. "Still here," Ruth said. "My grandfather built the house in '48, James said. I just thought." He stopped, then started again. "I just thought it should say something true." She looked at the sign for another moment, then at him, with the direct quality he'd gotten used to and now realized he would miss, on any day she didn't come. "It does," she said. Dot was in the yard behind them, ears at full alert, monitoring something in the grass with the total commitment of a young dog who has not yet learned to distinguish between important things and unimportant things. Bea watched from the porch, one eye open. The morning was warm and smelled like wet earth and cut grass, and the creek behind Route 1019 had been back within its banks for 3 weeks. James Calloway stood at the front gate of his grandfather's farm, next to a woman who had brought him casserole in a flood and had not asked him to be anything other than what he was, and looked at the sign he'd made from a piece of wood that had been waiting in a barn for longer than either of them had been alive. He had come here because he didn't know where else to go. He was starting to think that might have been the right reason after all.